I want to bring in NBC's Melanie Zanona on Capitol Hill. Owen Dahlkamp is a reporter, a reporting fellow for the Texas Tribune based in D.C. David Drucker is senior writer at the Dispatch and the author of In Trump's Shadow. With me here on set, Michael Hardaway, former communications director and spokesman for House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. David, Senator Booker said he wants the party to show more willingness to fight Trump. How does he accomplish that? Or can he accomplish that by fighting publicly with his colleagues?
Yeah, I don't think so, but this is typically what happens when a party is out of power and doesn't have the levers of power to actually make policy or stop the other party. There's a lot of frustration and there's a lot of cathartic emoting. Imploring your colleagues to do things they simply don't have the power to do. And there's always this internal battle. We saw this with Republicans for years under Barack Obama, and then even during the first Trump administration, where you'd have the far right flank demanding total objection, a total logjam, a total blockade of anything the president wanted to do, of anything the sort of more governing wing of the party wanted to do. And then you'd have the governing wing saying, listen, I wish, like you, that we could actually make policy and that we had more power, but we don't. And I'm going to do what I can to govern and serve my constituents in the meantime, even if it means working with the other side. And so this is a really old intra-party fight that both parties have when they're out of power, and particularly when one feels like it's in the wilderness, which Democrats in a sense are and definitely feel like they are.
Well, the polls show that they are.
Yeah, and of course, well, they do, but that doesn't mean that their voters aren't going to show up in big numbers this November and next November, right? So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. But listen, the politicians that demand fighting above all else, it usually works out well for them in terms of national stature and fundraising, at least in the short term.
So, Melanie, this exchange was indeed intense. We heard it in her voice. Seemed like Senator Klobuchar was getting emotional at one point, talking about police. As someone who covers the Hill every day, what's your big takeaway from what we saw there?
Yeah, this was incredibly emotional, incredibly fiery. We rarely see something like this play out so publicly, at least among members of the same party. But this has really been a debate that has been roiling the Democratic Party since Trump won back in November. And the fight is really about style. It's not really about substance. Even Senator Booker said in his speech and acknowledged that he actually supports several of the underlying bills that he was trying to block. Just take a listen.
I don't need somebody implying in any way that this is not vital to me and my state, that we have resources for our police officers. That's why I support this package. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of some of the bills in this package. But what I am tired of is when the President of the United States of America violates the Constitution, trashes our norms and traditions. And what does the Democratic Party do? Comply? Allow him? Beg for scraps? No, I demand justice.
And specifically, what Booker was taking issue with in these bills is the fact that some of the federal funding would not actually flow to some of the blue states and cities because of a Trump executive order freezing funding as it relates to DEI programs. Now, ultimately, Booker did withdraw his objection, and this package of bills actually did pass, but he made quite a splash on the Senate floor, similar to when he did that marathon filibuster speech. And so, of course, all of this really fueling speculation about whether Booker will run for president in 2028.
Yeah, a speculation that was already running high, Melanie. So, Michael, look, the guy's a great speaker. He knows how to capture people's attention. Did it seem to you like we had on one side Senator Klobuchar and Cortez Masto arguing about policy? He was talking about politics. He was talking about how we as a party need to get things done. What did you see?
Corey is right. It is naive of anyone to think that you can have policy without that being led by the politics. That is the business we are in. We are fighting the state of the republic. You have a president that is out of control, that violates the Constitution on a regular basis. You have 17 million people losing health care, and we want to talk about policy and pretend as though we're in regular order. We are not. And so Senate Democrats have to get out of this delusion some of them are in, where they're pretending as though this is George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or any other Republican in the White House that we could actually work with. Donald Trump is behaving like a dictator. We have to stop enabling that.
Do you think more Democrats agree with Cory Booker or agree with, come on, Congress, get stuff done already?
99% agree with Cory Booker.
99%.
Because the stuff you're getting done is what Donald Trump wants to get done. Why are you giving him the ammunition to subjugate you, which is what he is doing? And by the way, let's think about this. There are several votes and nominees that passed with just one slot, right? They just barely won. Why would Democrats, as we look at the redistricting and everything else, say, we're not going to go overboard in protecting that majority or whatever it is? We have to go overboard. Let's not respond to what Republicans will do. Let's go overboard and set the tone. Strike first.
So, David, there's this interesting op-ed in the New York Times from New York's Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado, who says it's time to offer Americans more than sternly worded social media posts and podcast interviews. He writes this about fighting Donald Trump. You can't beat an immoral agent of chaos with risk aversion. You beat him with moral clarity. I wonder if you agree, and if so, what does that look like?
Well, listen, voters, when they're unhappy, always like contrast and change. And so that's an old rule of politics, and it's not complicated. But I think what we're talking about here is, what do you do when you don't have the numbers? Democrats simply don't have the numbers. I mean, in the House of Representatives, the Republicans have a narrow majority, and so they often have a difficult time getting legislation passed. That's also true in the Senate. It's one of the reasons why they dumped as many policy items into the reconciliation package as they could, because they were able to skirt the filibuster that way. But I just kind of go back to where Republicans were a decade and a half ago, when they didn't have the power to do anything in the aftermath of the 2008 elections. And their grassroots were demanding that you fight, that you stop Obama, and they didn't have the numbers. And so, of course, at some point, Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, both Republican senators, cooked up this idea that they would defund Obamacare by stopping government funding and shutting down the government. And voters didn't like Obamacare yet. We were a decade away from them liking the Affordable Care Act. But even though they didn't like the bill and they didn't like the coming changes, they didn't think shutting down the government was a good idea. Look, Cory Booker wasn't proposing that. All I'm saying is, I understand where voters are coming from. I've seen it on both sides. But when you don't have the numbers on the Hill, or you don't control the White House, unless you want to exercise extra constitutional actions, you've got to wait and work toward the next election. Hopefully, from your perspective, you win some power. Then you can stop the other party.
Yeah. Oh, and you're reporting on an actual plan Democrats are working on to fight back against redistricting in Texas. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, so essentially, Democrats in Texas do not want to see these maps passed. They are not a fan of it. One of the tools that they have in their tool belt is something called a quorum break. The Texas legislature requires a 2/3 majority of members to be present in order to function. In theory, Democrats could flee the state and shut down the legislature and prevent any votes from happening on these maps. Now, this has happened in the past. In 2021, Texas Democrats fled the state in order to stop a slate of election laws from being passed that would overhaul Texas's election laws. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and Texas Republicans, in response, implemented a new requirement: a $500 daily fine for every member that is absent during a quorum break. This has to be paid out of their own pockets. But this is where some national Democrats have stepped in. On private fundraising calls, Democrats have been making the case to big dollar donors that they should shell out for this quorum break, according to 3 people that I spoke to who were either on the call or briefed on the call. These donors actually appeared willing to go forward with funding this quorum break, according to these people. But whether it'll be enough to actually convince the Democrats to go forward and have some sort of tangible resistance as they're seeking during this Trump administration remains a little unclear.
Which brings me to you, Michael. I mean, I was there in 2021 for a bit when they were starting all of this. And what they're saying now is, and we know it wasn't successful, but what they're saying now is we're buying ourselves some time. I mean, we don't even know what the Republican plan actually is, right? To have the Democrats mount a counter strategy. But what does it say to you, or what's the message your old boss wants to send by taking the time energy, going out there. What's he doing there?
This is Hakeem saying, I will not let you steal congressional seats. I will not let you, because by the way, in Texas, those are already heavily gerrymandered seats already. And so what Hakeem is saying here is that I'm going to protect the Democratic majority as we look to the midterms.
But are they protecting the Democratic majority by stealing seats of their own?
No, because the reality is that, again, in Texas in particular, those are already heavily gerrymandered. You could argue that there are several seats there the Democrats should currently have. Additionally, Donald Trump has said we may do this in 4 or 5 other states. And so this is Hakeem getting out in front and setting the tone and showing leadership.
Yeah, let's see what happens here in New York. There's a lot of complications. Every state has its own particularities, but we'll see what happens. Melanie Zanona, Owen Dahlkamp, David Drucker, Michael Hardaway, thank you all.